Hello, my name is Doug Soldat. I'm a professor and extension specialist with University of Wisconsin-Madison, and today we're going to be talking about controlling ground ivy. Ground ivy, also known as creeping Charlie, but for this presentation I'll mostly be using the word ground ivy, is one of the most difficult lawn weeds to control, one of the most common ones, also very difficult to control. It's perennial in the mint family. It was actually introduced in North America as a ground cover. So you can see right there, I got a plant tag there that shows Creeping Charlie on it. It says fast growing with mat-like growth. Light blue flowers, use as ground cover. And then it says plant in sun or shade. So there it is. We did this to ourselves. And now we have to figure out a way to deal with it. Okay, bright green leaves, round, kidney-shaped, scalloped edges. You can see some of the close-ups of the little hairs that'll be on those leaves. Like I said, it has square stems like those in the mint family do. And I think pretty beautiful flowers, these bluish purple funnel-shaped flowers. And of course, it does smell like mint when it's crushed. And it does have highly variable morphology. So you find different sized and shaped leaves as you go to different areas that are infested with ground ivy. Showing you a picture of that here. We got a sample from California on the left with these kind of compact, dense little leaves, and then a sample from North Dakota with a much different growth habit and larger leaves. This slide was provided by Zach Riker, who has done extensive research into ground ivy and the control of ground ivy. I'll be seeing a lot of slides from Dr. Riker today. Okay, so it can be confused with henbit. So here's a picture of henbit, which also has square stems and a minty odor when crushed. Henbit, though, is an annual versus ground ivy is a perennial. So this is a winter annual. It germinates in the fall, will survive as a tiny plant through winter. It'll flower in the spring, and you can see those kind of pinkish flowers there. And then it'll die in the summer, and then the seeds will fall to the soil and germinate again in the fall. One of the ways to tell henbit is, well, first of all, it's a taller growing plant. It doesn't creep the same way that Creeping Charlie does. But it also has especially the leaves near the surface are like directly attached to the stem. So they don't have another petiole. They don't have a separate stem that attaches them to the main stem. So that's a really key identifying characteristic for henbit. And then it's also confused with speedwell. There are many different species of speedwell, some of them ornamental and purchased and planted in perennial beds. This is often a perennial species that prefers shade and moist soils. It has square stems, but it won't smell minty when crushed. And it often invades lawns because it is creeping out of those perennial beds. And the leaves tend to be smaller than ground ivy, although there's a lot of variability in ground ivy's appearance. You can see the flowers have a bit of a different look to them as well. Okay, ground ivy spreads by seeds. It can spread by rhizomes, but more famously, it spreads rapidly by these creeping stems that root at the nodes. And that's shown in that picture along the top there, where the roots, you can see the roots coming off of those nodes and the shoots coming off the top. So any individual piece of that, anything with a node is going to produce a new plant, which will produce new stolons or runners. So this plant thrives in moist, shady areas, but also does perfectly well in full sun. So that's what makes it such a pernicious weed, is it's adaptable to a wide variety of conditions. The reason we see it so common in shady lawns is because grass does relatively poorly. So most grasses prefer full sun. Give them shade, they start to struggle and thin out, which gives ground ivy the competitive advantage. Okay, so cultural control. This is the first starting point for weeds and lawns, is think about the way that you fertilize and you mow and you irrigate to discourage weed invasion. So fertilizer slightly reduces ground ivy, so that's what you're looking at over here in this table from Kohler et al., 2004. They looked at ground ivy cover in relation to the amount of nitrogen applications, or pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. A typical lawn in Wisconsin will be fertilized somewhere in this range, 2 to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And you can see there's some reduction in ground ivy cover, maybe 20% at most. In that range. So you get a slight reduction, but still most people that are battling ground ivy are not going to be happy with 50% cover, especially if they're investing in 4 fertilizer applications per year. So fertilizer alone won't do it. Mowing height is not suspected to have an influence on ground ivy populations. And although, like we just said, it prefers wet and shady sites, it's also successful in sunny spots. So just pruning the trees and increasing sunlight is certainly not going to flip the balance alone. So we encourage people to use shade-tolerant turf grasses to compete better. That would be things like fine fescues. In Wisconsin, those will be the strongest competition in the shade, but they're certainly not the solution alone. So cultural control makes sense, but it's less effective compared to the ways that we can use cultural controls to control dandelion and clover, for example. Okay, mechanical control. I love this picture here from Richard Jaron of Iowa State University. Beautiful purple flowers here. Hand pulling can be effective for smaller populations, and in fact, if you want to use a chemical control method to get rid of most of it, and then be persistent in your hand pulling, that can be a good way to keep it out. But it's really impossible to remove all the stem and root pieces. So regrowth is basically certain, and it's going to be a constant thing. So if you're going to do mechanical control, you want to do it early. As soon as you see it, pull it out and be checking every single week. Every time you mow your lawn, be out there checking for ground ivy once the populations are manageable. Okay, let's talk about some of the alternatives to conventional herbicides. There are 2 that make sense. Borax, which is a laundry detergent that contains boron or boric acid, is kind of one of the more commonly recommended things you'll find on the internet. I do not recommend that you use boron for a couple reasons. We'll talk about that first. So while you can see in the table 3, this is showing the ground ivy coverage is influenced by boron and iron-based herbicides. So we have low rates and high rates of borax detergent prior to application. Let's just look at the high rate here. He had about 55% ground ivy, and then 1 week later, after the application, it was down to 25%. And then 2 weeks after that application, it was down to 9%. 3 weeks, it's almost all gone. 4 weeks, still almost all gone. And then ground ivy does what ground ivy does. It starts to grow back, 2%, 4%, And so and at those levels, you could hand pull it. Okay, so you say, Doug, that sounds great. Looks like it works. Well, it injures the turf grass. So boron is the reason it's killing ground ivy is because it's toxic, and it's also toxic to the Kentucky bluegrass. And if you look at table 4 below, it's showing the amount of injury, where 9 is no injury, and 6 is pretty injured. So this is Kentucky bluegrass that's pretty injured. Turfgrass quality is lower. And over time, boron will accumulate in soil, and you may not be able to grow anything there at all. So it's not labeled for use as an herbicide. It's a laundry detergent. And for that reason, we recommend you stay away from it. Now, as an alternative, FeHEDTA, or iron chelate, iron HEDTA, which is first introduced as the brand name Fiesta, is also works in the same way. It uses iron to kill by toxicity the plant. And Kentucky bluegrass and other grasses are much, much more tolerant of iron than they are boron. So you basically see the same effect. You started off with 70% ground ivy coverage, and then 1 week after application, you're down to 20, then you're down to 5, and then back up to 9 and 10, and then it starts to creep back up. So again, that's common with ground ivy control. You never completely get everything, and it takes persistence in multiple applications. But because we don't see the injury, if you look at the injury value here of the Fiesta, you can see that they're all 9s. They're not injured at all. Turf grass quality is actually higher, so it makes the grass look greener, makes the grass look healthier. So we really like these iron HDTA herbicides for control. It's another shot here of a healthy ground ivy infestation. You can see that it's in full sun there and still covering most of the lawn. Okay, so let's talk about chemical control with the conventional broadleaf herbicides. Okay, so triclopyr is the one that I recommend most often for controlling ground ivy. And you can see why here. We're looking at percent cover of various herbicides rated in June after an October application. So the ideal timing to control ground ivy is in the fall, in the late fall, usually around the time of first frost, which is likely going to be in October for most of Wisconsin. And then now we're looking the next June to see how much cover we got. So a couple things you notice in 1999, the control was the control treatment, which received nothing, was about 50% ground cover. In the year 2000, it went up to 76. So this is very heavy pressure. And so those have 54 has the letter D after it. So any treatment with the letter D means it's statistically similar to the control, means it didn't work at all. So the only two that have D's in them are right here. They have a C and a D, but the fact that it has a D and that the control has a D tells us those are the same. So 47, 44, yeah, those are lower than 54, but not low enough to be considered statistically different. So clopyralid didn't work. And then this product here, which was a traditional 3-way MCPP plus 2,4-D amine plus dicamba with slightly different ratios that you can see here. And one of the main differences was it had less of the 2,4-D in it and more of the MCPP. That didn't work. But everything else did. And the two that have the letters that are furthest away from D, that would be the 2,4-D ester. I got them highlighted in yellow here. It's got an A by it, and the triclopyr has an A by it. Those are the best products. So 2,4-D ester, triclopyr, statistically the best. And that effect was repeated in time. In the year 2000, for that study year, you can see triclopyr almost completely eliminated it, as did the 2,4-D ester. And then the 2,4-D amine did pretty well as well. Interestingly, the 2,4-D amine formulation, I'm going to explain what that means in a second, didn't do quite as well in 1999, but it did a little bit better in 2000. So our two winners here are 2,4-D ester and triclopyr. Other ones that work, fluroxapyr is a chemical that has pretty good efficacy. That's got B's by it, so no A's, but pretty good control out of that. Dicamba, very common ingredient, doesn't work very well at all. And in fact, in the year 2000, it's statistically similar to the non-treated control. Same with clopyralid in the year 2000. Okay, so there's variability. All herbicides don't work the same on triclopyr. Okay, so I promised you I'd tell you about the difference between 2,4-D amine and 2,4-D ester. These are just different forms of the herbicide, and they have different effects. Their formulation is different. So when I said the ester formulation is more effective on ground ivy, so that is what you'd be looking for. You have to look to the active ingredients on the herbicide label, and here you see mecoprop, which is MCPP. Abbreviated as MCPP. And then here you see 2,4-D dimethylamine salts. So there's the word amine, and that's what 2,4-D amine is. And if you look over here at, and this is Ortho's Weed Be Gone, that's the product we're looking at here. And then this is Gordon's Speed Zone. And Speed Zone, if you look at this label, has carfentrazone, ethyl, 2,4-D, 2-ethyl hexyl ester. So that is a 2,4-D ester formulation, which is going to be more effective than the amines. It also has MCPP and dicamba, which we said was completely ineffective. But if we're looking for an ester formulation of 2,4-D, you have to look on the active ingredients list to find it. Now, why I said I recommend triclopyr. Why do I do that? Because there is evidence of 2,4-D resistance, and that's what this graph is showing you. It's a study from 2017 that's showing you the percent injury of ground ivy in response to applications of 2,4-D. So you can see that the Ohio is the green. These are ground ivy samples from Ohio. They're near the top in terms of injury, so 2,4-D was very effective on those Ohio, and it looks like the California one's up there as well. But down here you can see that this one only had about 50 or 60% injury at the end of the 25-day study period, where most of these were up here in the 75 to 95%. And the reason for that is that there is some 2,4-D resistance observed here. So while we can see certain populations are controlled well with 2,4-D ester, that's not exclusively the case. Now, I don't have the data for triclopyr, but there's less variability in triclopyr resistance among different biotypes. There still is some variability, but in general, triclopyr is more effective across a wider range of biotypes. Okay, so here's a picture of some of that. We have the Nebraska population, which we just highlighted as being somewhat resistant to 2,4-D in the upper right portion of your screen, compared to the Ohio biotype, which you can see is mostly killed by the 2,4-D. And then on the left is what those plants looked like before the herbicide was applied. So you can tell the huge difference there in efficacy with those populations. Now, one thing about 2,4-D resistance is as soon as you have one plant that's resistant, it rapidly turns into more plants. And I'll show you a cartoon of that here. So let's say we just have one. Looks like we have 3 2,4-D tolerant or resistant biotypes here in this population, and the green ones are susceptible. We'll spray our 2,4-D, and that's going to kill most of the susceptible ones. The tolerant ones will survive, and because they survived, they are going to reproduce and regrow. And so now we're looking at maybe a 50-50 population. If we spray that with 2,4-D again, it's going to kill the ones that are not resistant. And what's going to leave behind is more 2,4-D resistant ground ivy. So of course, it doesn't happen just in a single season like that. This is after years and years of repeated use. But after a while, herbicides that are used consistently just become mostly ineffective. So chemical control strategies in general for ground ivy, we're going to say treat in September to early November is the best time. So when that plant is starting to harden off and shuttle things to its root systems, that's the best time. You might want to consider reapplication after 28 days. So if you have a really large population, you could apply in, let's say, mid-September and then reapply sometime in mid-October to really try to knock back the populations. Although if you're going to do it one time, around the first hard frost is about the best timing. Avoid mowing before and after application. You want the ground ivy leaves to be big to receive that herbicide that's being applied to them, and then you don't want to mow it off. You want to let that sit on the leaf and absorb into the plant for maximum efficacy. Consider rotating your chemistries. I know that I said, hey, I like triclopyr for this reason, but it's possible that we could run into triclopyr-resistant ground ivy if we use that single product control strategy. So these are the 3 chemistries that are different chemistries, and they have good efficacy. So triclopyr, fluoxapyr, and 2,4-D ester, and that has many names. And avoid dicamba because dicamba is one of the least effective herbicides on ground ivy. Okay, I talked about those iron HEDTA herbicides. I noted that Fiesta was kind of the first one to make it onto market. We can find all kinds of these products, Weed Beater FE, Lawn Weed Brew here, Sundays, Dandelion Doom. These all contain the active ingredient FE-HEDTA. And again, even though we can get ground ivy control with borax and boric acid and similar products, I don't like the phytotoxicity and the potential for buildup of that chemical in the soil. Is it possible that we get iron resistance on these populations? Yes, of course, that is possible. So that is something to consider, and a reason to work in a rotation of into control with this as well. And finally, if all else fails, just enjoy the ground ivy. Remember, this was introduced as a perennial. So sort of joking with that because we know that it can spread and take over a lot of areas, but every plant has its characteristics. So thank you for your time, and special thanks to Dr. Zach Riker of InView for many of the slides and the pictures and the data that he shared with me.